Esse é o nosso seminário mensal virtual da SBFim, e hoje à tarde a gente tem o prazer de ter o Rodrigo Verdi aqui com a gente. O Rodrigo é professor na Sloan, com uma carreira super bem sucedida em Financial Accounting. A lista de publicação dele é extensíssima, mais de 6.000 citações, e inclusive prestigiou a Revista Brasileira de Finanças com 3 artigos publicados lá também, né? Então, é um prazer ter o Rodrigo aqui com a gente hoje, que vai apresentar para a gente o paper The Strategic Choice of Peers in M&A Valuation. Rodrigo, você tem 1 hora ao todo. Conversando aqui com o Rodrigo, ele disse que ele aceita perguntas durante toda a apresentação para ficar mais interativo. Então, vamos lá. Rodrigo, a palavra é sua. Muito obrigado novamente.
Obrigado, Ricardo. Boa tarde a todos aqui. Eu estou vendo o pessoal entrando aí, várias pessoas que eu conheço, alguns amigos aí que tem na plateia, mas para mim é um prazer muito grande estar aqui, até coincidentemente, né, falando na SBF e na RBF também. Eu tive no primeiro encontro da SBFim, quando foi na GV em 2001. Na época eu tinha terminado meu mestrado e estava preparando para ir para o doutorado, e tive lá na primeira apresentação. Acabei vindo para cá. Nos últimos anos fui mais para a área de contabilidade, né? Apesar do meu mestrado ter sido em finanças, mas sempre ligado, faço muita coisa ligada a corporate finance, então nunca saí muito da área. E é um prazer grande e enorme poder estar de volta aí participando. Através da pandemia, essas coisas proporcionaram. Eu vou clicar nos slides aqui, compartilhar a tela, e aí vou passar para inglês, que o Ricardo falou que fazia apresentação em inglês. Então, para mim é mais fácil também, mas quem quiser perguntar, por favor, pode perguntar em português, não tem problema nenhum, não. Então, deixa eu compartilhar.
Rodrigo, só um aviso que eu esqueci de dizer. O Rodrigo gentilmente se ofereceu para ficar com a gente uns minutos depois do seminário, para um bate-papo informal sobre pesquisa, academia, carreira e outros. Não é isso, Rodrigo?
Isso. Então, a gente vai... O seminário vai das... horário de vocês aí, né? 4 horas, das 4 às 5. E depois, na próxima hora aí, não tem horário marcado, mas quem quiser fazer pergunta, porque eu falei para o Ricardo que ficaria à disposição aí para fazer um bate-papo. Então, a gente faz o seminário e depois passa para um bate-papo. Bom, vou lá então, vou apresentar o artigo aqui. Tá? Eu vou passar para o inglês então para a apresentação. So this paper, the title is Strategic Choice of Peers in M&A Valuations. This is actually with a Brazilian co-author. For those of you that don't know him, Gabriel is a professor at the University of Florida. He accounting PhD in Australia, went to Bocconi as assistant professor, and then moved to University of Florida a year ago. So he was working with Claudia at the time on this, and I met them in a European conference about 4 years ago, started talking about this idea. And Ben Yost is actually a student of mine that graduated from MIT and got a job at Boston College as assistant professor. So let me jump in straight to the paper here. So this paper, hold on, let me just get rid of them. Okay. So the paper is the research question on the paper is: does litigation risk affect the choice of peer comparables used in M&A? Especially for the students here in the group, whenever I read a paper, I'm thinking, what is the X variable? What's the Y variable? Right. So you can think of this paper as basically litigation risk being the construct of interest in terms of the X variable, and the peer choice here being the dependent variable. And the setting is FA, fairness of opinion evaluation. So my presentation is going to go slightly different than I normally present papers. Normally, you jump to the research question, the hypothesis, whereas here, at least for me, I wasn't quite familiar with fairness of opinion settings, and wasn't actually very familiar with the litigation risk in the way it happens here with these appraisal lawsuits. So I'm going to spend some time describing the setting, and I'm going to describe the litigation risk, and these two things together are going to line up to the hypothesis and the prediction in the paper. So just before I jump to an example, I think it's kind of helpful to see an example. Let me just kind of tell why we started this in the first place, right? What was the gap in the literature that got us to start working on this idea? So fairness of opinions, I'm going to give an example of a fairness of opinion in a minute. So bear with me if you're not familiar with what it is, but it's basically an opinion on how much the target price in M&A should be worth. And they happen all the time, but people don't quite agree on why, right? So the gap in the literature, what is the fairness of opinions used for? And there are basically two streams, right? One is that the fairness of opinions, they're used basically to justify a valuation to negotiate the stock price. So basically, there will be a few studies that is forthcoming the GFE right now that use the fairness of opinions and say, well, I choose this fairness of opinions to negotiate the stock price of the transaction. And that's a way to review information to the market. So one way of thinking about this, I think of the target says, well, we believe the stock is worth $22. And the acquirer says, well, I believe the stock is at most worth $18. So I'm willing to pay 18. I'm asking for 22, and you use this to negotiate a price, right? So under this scenario, you're using that as an instrument to say how much the target is worth, and the target is going to ask more from the acquirer, and then you try to settle in the middle. The other side argues that no, the fairness of opinion actually used to justify to the shareholders that the transaction is a good deal. So people question the validity of fairness of opinions as a tool to negotiate the price. And they argue that this is more to explain the transaction ex post. Something like this, the target says, well, according to our estimation, it's worth 18. And the acquirer says, well, we believe this is a good deal because of synergies, whatever, and it's worth 22. And the price is 20. So everybody's happy. The target felt they sold for more than what they believe it is. The shareholders think they pay less than what it's worth for them, and everybody is happy. Most of the evidence seems to be here. Our paper is more on this camp, primarily because when you see transactions that have acquirer and a target opinion, what we find is more of the latter. Then the target valuations are below the acquirer valuations. The only difference is that we put a litigation spin on it. So our story is that it happens, but it happens because of lawsuit. So it's a tool that it's used to close the deal and to minimize the total cost of the transaction by lowering exposure to appraisal risk, right? So that's going to be the mechanism that we're going to propose in this paper. And we use this also because from empirical strategies, there are like good shocks to litigation that we can use to isolate, right, in an empirical sense. As I said, I'm going to jump in here, give an example, but if anyone has any questions, just through the chat or raise the hand or just jump in here, feel free to ask at any time. So what are FOs? So let me give for people that are not familiar. I certainly was not. So let me give an example. What are these fairness of opinions, right? So fairness of opinions essentially a report issued by a third party to justify what they believe the proposed transaction price should be. What's the fair value of the target? Right? It's normally done by the target firms. 80% of the transactions have a fairness of opinion from the target. And occasionally the acquirers also have to issue a fairness of opinion. If they issue a certain amount of stock, there are certain criteria that if the deal classifies, they have to issue. It's far less common. So for the most part, the target issues a fairness of opinion, not so much the acquirer. And normally it's done by investment advisors. So those are the 4 or 5 that have issued most fairness of opinions in our sample. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Credit Suisse is another big one, Bank of America, and they issue a fee. And as I said, and it's going to be clear in a minute, the fairness of opinions can be used at least twice, one by the board or the manager to negotiate the price. So that's the theory that you use this to negotiate the price of the transaction, or potentially later by the shareholders when they are approving the deal. So this is more of the argument that you want a number that the shareholders will be happy, not so much to negotiate the price, but actually a number that the shareholders later will agree and say, okay, the transaction was a good one. I'm willing to sell. And as I'm going to show in a minute, there are many ways that these fairness of opinions are written with different valuation methods. This is a chart from one of the practitioners that says, for the most part, when an expert like investment advisor is hired to do this, they say the target's worth $20 a share. For the most part, either they use peer companies or they use DCF, discounted cash flow. And they use a different one, similar deals, the historical prices, and so on, but the most common are here. When we started to do this paper, all these studies on fairness of opinions have focused on the presence of opinions or DCF. Ours was the first that was actually looking at the peer choice. Right now, there is this GFE paper that's forthcoming that also looks at the peer choice. In a way, it's one of these, like there is a competing paper out, not competing, but some trying to do it like the kind of the same thing. So I'm going to give, so our paper is going to use peer choice, right? So I'm going to give an example for fairness of opinion that are like an actual transaction in our sample. So here's an example for what a fairness of opinion will be. So this is a transaction which the target is Zygo Corporation, acquired by Emetec, and the investment bank was Barclays. So Barclays filed a form with the SEC, and in the form, well, they actually, I think that the target files it, but in the form, there is a valuation from Barclays, and Barclays would say, well, we review and compare the financial performance, doing like peer comparison analysis, and here the companies that we identify as the peers. Right, so based on their analysis, these are the 8 peers to Zygo Corporation that they believe are the right set of peers. The way they do this is that for these 8 peers, they will look at valuation multiples, like say enterprise to revenue, enterprise to EBITDA, and price to earnings ratio. They say the PE ratio, it's from 17 and 20, enterprise to revenue to sales between 1 and 2.5. This is like the ballpark, the range. Once we get these ratios for these 8 companies, 3 ratios, 2 years, we come up with what they believe it's the range of reasonable estimate. So they would say, for example, based on our judgments, the range for enterprise to revenue should be between 1.3 and 1.7. And then they do the same for the other ratios, and they apply this to the target, right, to the sales and to the earnings of the target. And they say, well, according to our calculations, this is what we believe the price to be. So in this example, they're giving a range, and if you average this range here, you'd see that this deal is worth between like 16 and 18. That's basically the value that they expect the target to be, right? It just so happened in this transaction, I think this is reflective of what happens in our sample in general, is that the valuation, it's normally higher than the trading price, but lower than actually the transaction price. Right, so that will be in line with that idea that the transaction closed for 19, and for the shareholders, look at this, the valuation suggests between 6 and 18, right? So the deal was fair in a way. It's the targets got at least as much as what their expert valuation expects it to be. So this is a fairness of opinion. Our story is that because of this litigation risk, which I will introduce in a minute, there are incentives for either the manager or the target or the investment banking to move the peer selection to the left, meaning make the evaluation smaller, right? So the prediction that we'll have is that if anything, when the risk of lawsuit is high, this number here is going to move to the left. Because the lower this number is, the more attractive the deal is perceived to be relative to the valuation. And that lowers this risk of potentially getting sued, right? So that's the argument that we're going to. So this is the Y variable in the paper. Now I'm going to try to kind of justify the X variable that we looked at, which is appraisal risk, and why exactly we focus on appraisal risk. So what are these appraisal risks? This is actually something relatively new to me. I wasn't kind of familiar with this, but I'll tell this more. But actually, it turns out I worked in one case. I just didn't realize it was called appraisal risk. When I was working, it's interesting. It's one of the few things in my life that I'm doing the paper, and I happen actually to know, well, like from a practical experience. For the most part, I'm an academic and have no idea what's out there. This one happened. It just took me like a year and a half to work on both things to realize they were actually the same. So which was a bit of embarrassing, but I'll tell that story in a minute. So what is this appraisal risk? So essentially, appraisal risk are situations when the target believes that the price was too low. Right? So let's say the transaction closed at 19, and the target believes that the price should have been $21, and they say, I don't want to sell for 19. So in order for the minority shareholders not to be squeezed and forced to tender their shares, they have the option to sue and to ask for appraisal. So this is a rule in the Delaware Code that states that any stockholder or shareholders of this estate, so this is applicable to Delaware, who continues to hold the shares at the effective date of the transaction, so you have to be shareholders as of the record date and the effective date of the deal, and that did not vote in favor nor consented with the deal. So the time the deal is proposed, they have to say, I don't agree. I think this price is too low. I don't want to receive the price. And as a result, I would like it to be appraised by the court. Right? So that's so, but you have to tell this up front that as a way you protect the minority shareholder to have an independent appraisal of what they believe the target price should be. So I'm going to give an example, right? Just kind of give an anecdote. It's actually a very important one that changed this lawsuit strategy in the market quite a bit. So in 2005, there was this merger with transkaryotic therapies. So this Shire was the acquirer, transkaryotic was the target. And the acquirer agreed to pay $37 per share, 44% premium. So a very large premium. Nonetheless, at that time, about 10% of the shareholders said, I don't agree. I don't want to vote, right? I vote against, so I don't vote because I would like this to be appraised. I think 44% it's too low. The interesting thing is that in this shareholder meeting, the deal was approved with a 52% approval rate. So I'll put this in timeline just so you get a sense of what happened here. So what happened is that at the record date, 10% of the shareholders said, I don't agree, and I want this to be appraised. And at the shareholder meeting, 52% voted in favor. What leaves out here is that there is still another 38% that didn't say I don't agree or voted, right, to sum up to the 100. So there is this 38% there. In this case, what happened is that even though 10% of the shareholders held the share, when they sued, they asked for the whole, actually not 48, but in that case of the lawsuit, 38%. And the court ruled in favor, right? So essentially what happened is that this created, so let me go back to the chart here. This created an arbitrage opportunity that you could have, let's say, a 10% here. You wait for the transaction to be approved and you buy another, let's say 38%, and you sue for the totality, right? So whereas in the past, until then, the idea was that you just sue for the record of date, which was 10%, and there was a risk that the transaction not go through. So you buy those shares, but then the transaction doesn't complete, the deal drops price and you lose money. But now, all of a sudden, you could buy a small portion and say, I don't agree with the price, wait for the transaction to clear to shareholder vote, and then buy large volumes and sue for the whole amount. And the court, Chancery Court, actually ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. And essentially what happened is that these lawsuits all of a sudden exploded. So if you look in here later in the sample period, 1 in every 4 deals had a lawsuit, right? So essentially for the deals in Delaware, if you have an M&A, 1 in every 4, you expect that to be sued. It became a very common phenomenon in 2011, 12, 13. The rule passed in 2007. Then here comes a bit of the crisis, and then later, as the deals picked up, you start seeing a lot of these lawsuits. Right? Essentially, our story is that here there is a higher litigation period, and because of the higher litigation, that changed the way these fairness of opinions were created. And the incentive is that because of that, you would like to minimize their risk, and as a result, you would lower the appraisal to minimize that lawsuit risk.
Rodrigo.
Yep.
Sorry, just to make sure I got the context. So in this case, you told us this company was missing this fairness opinion. Is that the case? They didn't have one.
No, they had it. They actually had it. But nonetheless, the plaintiffs just said, well, we don't agree with the price, right? And then the question is, how is it that the fairness of opinion is informative? Yeah, I think that's a related part of your question, right? And the way it is informative is that the moment that the plaintiffs sue, they come up with their own fairness of opinion, and the defendants are going to use their own fairness of opinion. So these are basically two expert reports that are written to justify, we believe that it's worth 18. The plaintiffs will say, well, I believe it's worth 22, and bring this to the judge for the judge to rule in favor or against. So I don't know if that answers your question, but they actually had a fairness of opinion. I should probably know exactly what the fairness of opinion was in that one.
No, it's just because I misunderstood that that they needed a low valuation to back them in court against lawsuits.
That's correct. So that doesn't change the fact that they had the fairness of opinion. Our hypothesis, because most of them have, pretty much 90% of the deals have fairness of opinion. Our prediction is more like that when the risk of litigation is high, the fairness of opinions are going to be lower in amount, right? So they had it. The question is whether over time that the valuation decreased relative, right? Like say it's the choice of the peers are such that you don't just file like a 19 anymore, but you say it's worth 18 or even 17. So that later can be used in court exactly for the reasons you said, Ricardo, that say, well, our valuation, we hire Goldman Sachs, they say it's worth $17, we got 19. I don't know why these plaintiffs are suing, because this was a great deal for them. That's in essence the argument, right? And then of course, the plaintiffs are gonna hire somebody that will do a DCF and their own peer choice and say, no, 17, this is nitpicking. We believe it's actually 22 when we use a different peer choice or different assumptions of a DCF. We believe the valuation is much higher. 17 is a penny on it, and we believe the price was too low. For the most part, Ricardo, what happens is that for this to have merit in court, you have to argue that the transaction was not, the bidding was not competitive, right? It was arranged in a way like a going private transaction or an arm's length type situation in which the acquirer and the target are colluding. And there is a chance of squeezing like expropriation of minority shareholders, right? It's hard to believe in a very competitive pricing. If you have multiple bidders, for example, that you're going to collude in a low price, right? You'll sell to the highest bidder. And then, so in court, in competitive prices, it's less likely that the plaintiffs win. But in these situations, that the bidding is less likely to be competitive. Those are the cases that they tend to win in court. A bit of just kind of like a background here. This is so what happened is that this rule was created to protect minority shareholders, individuals. But after the passage of that rule, essentially became a hedge fund trading strategy, right? So a few hedge funds started basically waiting for the announcement, buying enough to have a record date, notifying that they're going to sue, waiting for the transaction to complete, and start buying more shares and then suing to the most possible part, right? And there are a few studies in the law journals that argue that, I think I have it here, this paper in the Journal of Law and Economics argue that the hedge funds were earning like 30 or so % as a return here, right? Of course, there is risk to this strategy, but actually kind of they were earn quite a bit in terms of using this model. What do we know? This is another practitioner article. So most of these deals, 80% of them settle out of court. So to the extent that they are settling, it's because the acquirer and the target enter into agreement, which means that the target got something, right? Otherwise, the target wouldn't settle. So 80% of them, there is a positive return to the target. In the 20 or so that go to court, what these studies find is that sometimes the plaintiffs lose money. Actually, the judge ruled against them. But for the most part, it rules in favor. And when it rules in favor, sometimes there are very large payoffs to the tune of 18% on average per transaction. And these are the deals that go to court. There are also all the positive cases that don't even go to court, they settle ahead of court, right? So this this became quite popular as a transaction. One thing that you don't have in the paper, in the version that I'm presenting, but my sample stopped here in 2015. But most recent, actually, the outcomes have been negative for the lawsuit. So there is a reversal, and this is something we're exploiting here in the paper, because you have this nice situation that here the risk was very high, and then later you have a situation that the risk was low. And what I'm trying to show empirically is that what goes in one direction, one period, actually reverses in the other, which is kind of nice for identification standpoint. Anyway, so this is the kind of the high level of the paper. So that brings to the argument, right? So the hypothesis in the paper essentially is that this peer selection in Delaware, because that's the state that has the rule, and most of these lawsuits take place, is that the peer selection is going to move to the left, will have a downward bias the higher the litigation risk is, right? So we're going to use these in like a difference in difference type regression, in which you're going to exploit the difference in the peer choice before and after the rule for Delaware and non-Delaware companies. Enrique?
Rodrigo, I think I have missed, but how do you measure the litigation risk?
Yeah, so the way we're going to do in the paper, essentially, well, let me go back in here. This picture is a good one. Essentially, what we're going to do is use the 2005 rule, which was passed in 2007, and basically use the pre-post as a low litigation and the post period as a high litigation window.
Okay. Thank you.
And of course, and that identification holds for Delaware, but it doesn't hold for the other states because the rule is not applicable or enforceable in other states, right? So then the research design, I mean, like another way to show this is, let me jump in here. I'll come back to this in a minute. But basically, the regression specification will be a diff and diff coefficient, right? So then here is basically where the action takes place. In post 2007, that's the rule that we use, right? So in the post 2007 period, the risk for Delaware firm was higher. And we argue that because of the higher, the valuations are going to be lower. So this variable here, which I haven't explained, will come down in periods of high litigation risk, right? So essentially what the regression is saying, the key hypothesis, the beta 3 is less than 0. So the diff and diff coefficient, you lower the choice of peers when the litigation risk increase.
Rodrigo, it's related to my first question. So your story is that from the agent perspective, by looking for a lower fairness opinion, he is going to lower the risk of litigation. Is that the point?
That is correct. Of course, the key issue here, I think, is that who's the agent, right? Who is the agent? Because here, the fairness of opinion you're hiring, it's hired by the target managers, which is hiring, let's say, Goldman Sachs, right?
They are the agents, no? The
yes,
managers.
And the question is that, is it because of the investment advisors, Goldman Sachs has the incentives to do that? Or is it because the managers of the target has the incentives to do that? Or is it because the acquirer has the incentives not to pay this and then convince the target, or then convince the investment advisor, right? So the ambiguity in the argument is that it could be driven by the incentives from the investment advisors or the managers, or even the acquirers who don't want to pay the higher premium, right? What I find most, and this is a bit of speculation on my part, because I think the analysis as we're revising the paper have a better sense. We don't have very strong evidence that the investment advisors are like the biggest driver here. We do find that it's coming from the managers working with the acquirers in situations that the managers have incentives because they stay in the combined firm, right? They tend to be like, so in a way they are acting like the acquirer. They have incentives to acquire, or they have the reputation at stake because they are named plaintiffs in the lawsuit. One thing, Ricardo, that it's kind of interesting is that when you look at the lawsuits, right, normally they sue the target firm, they sue the managers of the target firm. They don't actually sue Goldman Sachs or the Morgan Stanley or the investment advisor. So the investment advisor rarely name plaintiff. I mean, for me, being an accountant, this is interesting because like in a fraud type situation, normally the auditing firm, right, Pricewaterhouse, KPMG, Deloitte, they're often named plaintiffs. Like say, so they sue the firm, they've committed the fraud, and you sue the auditors. But here you sue the target, but you don't actually sue the investment advisors as much, right? So they're less on the hook. And actually our evidence, we don't find super strong evidence from the investment advisor here. It's more, seems more of a manager story to me. So one thing here primarily is also for the students or people in the audience. So in terms of the structure, right? So what is our research design? So we have the main hypothesis. So this is essentially like the kind of H1 in the paper, right? So that's the key prediction, which is kind of the peer choice. And one thing I always wonder is that, you know, you work on a paper like this, you know, like, are people going to care about the peer choice, right? Is this something that it's going to sell? And I would hope that is yes, but you never know what the taste will be from the editor, the reviewer, and people, right? So part of the paper is that we look at the peers, but we actually look at like, if you will, like a so what? Why is this important? It's important because it affects the merger premiums, these valuations, the extent of lawsuits, right? Which is something that people care more. If it affects M&A premiums and lawsuits, they will care a bit more. The peer choice, maybe they won't care as much. And the other thing we're trying to do in the paper is really like trying to say exactly what Ricardo was saying, right? Who's the agent here, and then trying to provide a bit of a story on the incentives. So this is more like the why, like trying to provide evidence on the mechanism. So here's the evidence, here's the mechanism, but here's the implication, right? So that's kind of the way we try to sell the evidence. Let me present a few results. So for this to make sense, the identification is a very classic diff in diff, in which you're comparing Delaware, firms incorporated in Delaware, where the Chancery Court is and the rule is present, to other states before and after 2007. But the key variable of interest, at least for the main hypothesis right now, is this thing called the PPP. PPP is this just a short for peer portfolio percentile, which is essentially where the peer distribution sits relative to a hypothetical set of peers that could have been selected. So the good way of thinking about this, it's in this picture here. Right, so in a picture like this, imagine here it's a density function of EVS, or enterprise value to sales. So here will be firms with very high valuation, and here firms with relatively low valuation. And then basically you come up with a pool of who is the possible peers, right? In the paper, we do this in a few different ways. You say, well, anybody that is in the same industry as the target, or the industry in similar market caps, so you might need to match, or come up with a pool of who is the possible peers, and then plot the distribution of the enterprise valuation to sales ratio. And then we hand collect who the peers actually are, right? And then to the extent that we get the right pool of gray charts here with the possible peers, if we had the right pool, then the pink distribution should sit in the middle. Of course, it's open to measurement error, because the pink could be to the left, but also the gray group could be just an incorrect peer group, right? So then, so we toy with a few variations for who the possible set of peers is, like say SIC, Holberg and Phillips have another one, and then you can do like say size, market cap type groups. When we do this, what we find is that the distribution of this variable has a mean value of 0.38. Suggesting that if you went back here, the mean valuation of the peers, it's around the 38th percentile of the pool of other peers, right? So it's that you tend to identify peers that are on the left of the pool of possible peers. Of course, this is not perfect. It could just simply be that you the target firms tend to be low valued firms. That tell you why they're being bought in the first place, right? So we try with a few variations of possible peers, but in general, we tend to find that it's towards the left. Our hypothesis is not so much whether this number is 38 or 45 or 50 or 60, but it's whether that number decreases when litigation risk goes up. Right, so let's say if you have a right baseline and the baseline is the 38 percentile, that's the typical peer choice is 38. We're going to predict that when mitigation risk is high, you use peers that have a lower valuation, because in case you go to court or to prevent the likelihood somebody is going to sue, I suggest that the deal was attractive for the target shareholders. So if you get to the results, the first result in the paper is a typical diff in diff regression. So we have kind of Delaware post 2007 and a coefficient of 0.126. Right. So a way to think about this is to calibrate the magnitude of this finding. Remember, the average was 38. Right. So if you look at the distribution, you're picking up peers that on average have a 38 percentile. And what we find is in the post 2007, that shift from 38 to 26, right? So it's a pretty substantial shift, actually, almost like maybe a bit too strong even, right? I mean, that's one thing that these empirics went, but it is a non-trivial amount relative to the distribution that we have. And that seems to actually, we have a larger sample result now that they're a bit smaller in magnitude, but it is non-trivial shift that we tend to document. The other thing that we did on the paper, especially for kind of the students here in the audience, I think in a diff regression, we always try to kind of like calibrate the parallel trends and see what happens in the pre-period versus in the post-period. And here we have some good results we like, some that we don't necessarily like. So the first thing we find is that there is basically no differential result before 2005, 2007, when the rule took place. So it suggests that the peer choice was similar between Delaware and non-Delaware state deals until 2007. What we find that it's a bit troublesome is that actually the results start to hold, but only after 2011, not immediately after, right? So that's not that. Then you have to explain that this 3-year delay, 4-year delay, which is never something we felt very comfortable. It turns out that the law studies say that this is actually when the lawsuits took place. There are not that many people suing in 2008 and 2009. There are more important things at that time going on but it is discomforting in a way. And one thing that we are working on the paper right now is that I don't know why we did it this way, but when the first draft, the draft that I sent, all the acquirers are public acquirers. And then in reading some of this material, people say that often when the acquirer is private, it's when these deals are more complicated because this negotiation is not as transparent. So we've been collecting this data. So if you're looking here, our sample is like 600 deals right now, and we've been collecting the data for about, let's say, 1,800 deals now, much larger sample. And here, actually, the results are a little bit stronger, more like immediately post 2007. So that's something I didn't know what I was going to find, but I'm kind of happy with the results in the sense that they look more timely and not these 3 years, which is it's a bit strange. So this is not in the paper, but something we're doing with the revision right now. Take a sip of water here. Any questions? I'm sure there are questions. Maybe if I pause.
Hi, can I make a question?
Yeah, please.
So very interesting. One thing that I was thinking about is like the lawsuit is in 2007, but were there like appeals and things going on like in the judicial like dimension to like whether it took a time for maybe to become a precedent and to impact decisions and practices? Do you know?
It did. In terms of the lawsuits, I mean, because that 2005 was one of the very extreme rulings, it took a while for some of these lawsuits to increase. Pedro, the other thing that happened actually, which is something we didn't have in this draft, but we are doing now, is that more recent, there was a going private transaction by Dell. And then there were two or more that happened in 2015 and 16, in which the Supreme Court ruled against the plaintiffs. So there was actually a reversal, and the Delaware court ruled in favor, and then the Supreme Court said, no, we don't agree, and actually through the appeals it reversed. And I think I have this here, I can jump ahead one second. So it turns out that the lawsuits, we had this sample here, but now in the paper, we're trying to actually see what happens here versus the more recent period that these lawsuits completely stopped. There are 3 reversals by the Supreme Court that essentially changed that. This is not in the paper. This is what we're asking, right? So what happened, the timelines in these appeals? There were appeals and in 2007, 8, 9, but nothing that reversed that much. But there are a lot that has happened in 2016 to 17 and 18. And one thing we're doing this draft now is that we collect the data until 2020, just before the pandemic. And we have been running almost 2 samples in the paper. So one is this post 2007, the way you've seen, but the other one is a different diff in the period that the litigation was really high to litigation being low. And it's actually quite interesting that it completely flips, right? So this is one of these kind of almost luxury moments in empirical research. You can get like that, you prove the argument one way, and then you find a reversal, and you hope that it kind of holds when it reverses. And actually, it holds quite strongly there. So, so that's something we hope to fold into the paper in the revision. Any other questions? I have a few other tables, but I'm happy to take a few questions and just so I'll move back here. So just.
Rodrigo, does it make sense to control for previous litigation results so as to, if the company is going to go into court because of previous good results, and then this is an incentive or something like that?
Yeah, it's in a way what these results. I mean, this is I mean, the thing here, Henrique, is that whether this is a bit of the narrative in these results here, is that it became, right, like say you had one court ruling, and then you had another one, and then it escalates. I don't know if I would control for it, because in a way, this is part of what we're trying to explain, is this idea that the risk got stronger because there is precedence. Mm-hmm. But the results seem to be correlated with that movement, absolutely. And then, of course, what you're trying to do, I mean, you can do this piecewise meal in a way and say, here, a period with very low, mid, high, and it seems to map. But right now in the paper, we basically just show this period did increase somewhat proportionally, and then it reversed, right? But it in the spirit of what you're saying, the precedence became much stronger after 2011. Certainly 2011 to 16, almost 17 is the period that there were lots of these lawsuits. Turns out, just to tell a side story here, but I work with another professor in the group sometimes in this litigation case, and this is the case that I kind of didn't realize was a appraisal lawsuit, but it was a going private transaction. So it was one of these situations that the acquirer was private, taking the company private around 2015 at the height of the story. And we are actually on the plaintiff side and had to come up with a valuation, and the valuation did the DCF and use the peers, and like say very much in line with the story here. This is one example that settled out of court. So they settled on an amount, the plaintiffs are happy and walked away, but it was right in the period this was at the highest. It didn't occur to me because even though this happened in 2005, the lawsuit took a few years to drag, right? So it took like into 17, 18.
Rodrigo, just a comment. It would be good to have accounting that, well, if you are a manager and you have a fairness opinion that is lower, chances are higher that you get rid of the lawsuit. And then by learning a long time, you would see this behavior becoming more and more pervasive, no?
Yeah, so this is part of the evidence here. So if I look in here, let me jump this analysis a little bit. So I may come back to this depending on the time, but that essentially, Ricardo, like the closest we have to what you're saying is we don't have the core rulings. The problem is that you don't see the outcomes. 80% they settle out of court, so we don't know how much was paid, what was the extra that was paid. And actually this data now for the 20% or so we can observe. What we do is basically the chance that you actually get sued in the first place, right? So that analysis we have. So let me jump ahead a little bit and I'll come back. So this is not our paper. This is one other study out there that precedes ours that shows that post 2007, according to that chart, the likelihood of litigation increased, like say 14% here in this sample, right? If you did like a regression of control variables. And what we find is that if you use this sample, decompose the samples that had these low peer evaluations versus the high peer evaluation, and that's a bit problematic because that's an endogenous variable here. But if you put them in very high peers and low peers, what happens is that the increase in lawsuit, it's only in the firms that had the high peer evaluations. So the low peer evaluation actually, at least no significant, right? There's a 6% increase, but not statistically significant from zero. We don't know the settlement amounts, and we don't know the court, what they ruled in favor. But we do know that actually the lower peer amount does lower the likelihood of these lawsuits, right? Which is kind of very much in line with what you're saying, is that just that we don't know the outcome, we just know the likelihood. And then what we find in the paper, right? The question in the paper is that, but if you're going to lowball, you also might sacrifice in value in the transaction because you're the target firm. If you're going to say it's worth 18, you're not going to get $22 for it, right? So then we test the implications for actually the premium, and that is evidence very similar, right? So the literature shows that in these periods of high litigation, the premiums went up. Because then the higher you paid for it, the acquired, the less likely you're going to get sued in the first place. But again, only for the ones that had the high premium here, the low PPP, actually there is no increase. If anything, the premium is a bit lower, right? So here it's one of these stories that goes back to the question I had about the agent, because if the manager that is selling is doing this, you might not get sued, but you're also getting paid less for. Right, so if you hold a lot of stock, you're basically tending your stocks at a lower amount. But you're also not getting sued. You're not named plaintiffs on case. There's a reputational argument, and so that's why we exploit in the middle part of the paper, like this idea of these incentives for the managers. But it is that. So that's the part that what we don't know what to do in the paper right now is to push this more or the peer choice more, because this is more interesting in terms of the outcomes, right? It's more implications for the loan suits directly, as well as for the valuation. Let me show a couple other things that we did in the paper. So I'll go back here. So in the paper, I mean, like here, what we find is basically there is lower lawsuits, but also comes at a lower premium, which will, of course, raise the question of why is it that the manager would agree to do that in the first place, right? So the other part of the paper tried to exploit, is this coming from the manager incentives or potentially from the investment advisor incentives? And I'll show the results, but I also say what I believe. I think there is some evidence here on the target, and I'll show the evidence. I think the investment advisor, it's a story in our sample list is weak at best. There isn't much strong there. And some of these studies that try to look at whether there are conflicts of interest with Morgan, Goldman, some of these institutions, or even the other institutions like the less reputable ones, the evidence is it's pretty weak. So the one I like more, it's the one that we are actually working the analysis right now, is exploiting situations that is like a potential agency conflict, low and high. And essentially the agency story here is that the CEO of the target, it has a retention, with the acquirer, right? So in essence, that CEO that is selling, it's selling, but also with the interest to surviving, right? It's not just I want to sell, get paid, and walk away, right? If you're going to sell, get paid, or away, you care for the most money you can get. But other than not getting sued and have a reputation damage, of course. But here, on top of that, the transaction that the negotiation takes place, that the target firm remains the management team, right? So you cash out the investors, but the management team stays with the acquirer. So the agent's conflict is that the manager is acting potentially in the interest of the combined entity as opposed to the entity that is just selling. And that's where we tend to find most of the strong results. Right? In the revised draft, we are changing this test a bit, but tends to be situations in which the negotiation, it's not very arm's length, very, very competitive, to the extent that there is a potential conflict, the target selling in a less than competitive price. That's why we're trying to get good data to be able to isolate that. We also do some tests with the investment bank, like the top advisors, non-top advisors. And you can stretch here and say we find some results more in the non-top advisors, but this is not statistically significant difference, and it's actually not a super strong result. So I'm not sure what we're going to do with that in the paper later. Like we might have as one table, like, by the way, we also look at this, but didn't find much. It's not central part of the story, at least to us. Yeah, so then, so I'm going to wrap up in a couple minutes, but for the most part, right? So what we find in the paper is that, yes, when we find that there is higher litigation, we do find that the peer selection tend to be with a downward bias. So it reduces the valuation of the peer choice. We tend to find that this happens mainly when the target CEO acts together with the acquirer, right? It's more worried about staying with the acquirer firm, less so than cashing out and walking away. And the implication of that is that in this situation, we tend to find lower lawsuits, but also at the potential expense for the target shareholders of potentially lower premium of the deal in the first place. Right, so that would be my kind of my summary slide. I mean, I have one or two other things, but those are additional slides. So this is like the central message of the paper. Any questions or any comments? So then first of all, like, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to present. And of course, as I said, I'm happy to mudar para o português aí e fazer bate-papo. Mas eu queria agradecer a oportunidade de apresentar aqui e ver alguns amigos aí que estão na audiência e participar. Obrigado. Obrigado, Ricardo.
Rodrigo, eu posso fazer uma pergunta?
Muito obrigado, Rodrigo.
O Henrique ainda tem uma pergunta aí.
É só uma pergunta para clarificar, assim, essa relação do target CEO com o acquirer é algo que a gente só sabe a posteriori, né?
Sim, isso é a posteriori. O que a gente tem ex ante é tipo assim, se o bid foi competitive, por exemplo, na SDC, eles têm, não é uma coisa que eu conheço muito, tá? Mas eles têm assim, por exemplo, quando tem Go Shopping, não é um deal negociado com um acquire direto, mas te abre para 3 ou 4 acquires, multiple bidders. Isso é uma coisa que a gente tem na hora do processo de decisão. Ou então, por exemplo, quando é uma going private transaction, porque tu sabe quem é o acquirer, tu sabe se vai ser uma public entity ou not, isso é um pouco mais ex ante. O retention and ex post, inclusive, a gente não sabe com certeza, tem que procurar o nome e tem que ter certeza que vai achar o nome na combined entity depois do deal, né? Pode ser casos que estão lá, mas não é um cargo tão alto que talvez nem enxergue.
Professor Rodrigo, eu gostaria de fazer uma pergunta, se fosse possível.
Claro.
Primeiramente, parabéns pela apresentação, fantástico o paper. Nossa, uma porrada de informação que a gente fica se questionando aqui. Eu fiquei curioso, uma informação muito específica, que no ano de 2014, o número de lawsuits despenca de maneira consistente em relação aos anos 2013 e 2015. Tem alguma hipótese específica para isso ter acontecido?
Só dar uma olhadinha aqui, porque...
Acho que está na table 1 ou 2.
É interessante. Isso aqui... Eu não
Acho que
sei
é na
te
anterior
dizer.
ainda. Acho que é na anterior
Não,
ainda.
isso aqui mas é o mesmo resultado aqui. Eu estava na outra tabela. Isso aqui são dados que a gente coletou recentemente, agora que tem os dados a partir de 2015, né? E, sim, não sei te dizer por que caiu em 2014. Pode ter sido que o Pedro estava perguntando se teve algum apelo, se teve alguma coisa na corte, mas não, até que eu saiba, a maioria dos apelos que foram contra forte foram a partir de 2015. Mas eu vou dar uma olhada, pode ser que seja exatamente o que o Pedro estava falando, 2013 ou 2012, e talvez tenha baixado naquela época.
Professor, tem umas perguntas aqui. Desculpa, Cristiano.
Não, eu já terminei. Obrigado.
Legal.
E aí, Paulo? Tudo bem, Paulo?
Tudo, João. É satisfação falar com o senhor novamente. Eu estava aqui me preparando, mas aí o senhor já fez a transição para o português, aí então vamos lá.
O português ficou mais fácil, né?
Não,
Agora vai aparecer umas 50 perguntas aí.
Eu estava aqui respirando, treinando, falei, vou fazer bonitinho, mas enfim, já foi. Vamos lá. A gente sabe que o Fairness Opinion ele é algo não mandatório, né? E ele começou a partir de um caso clássico lá do Van Court, em Delaware também, em 2001. Então, quando você coloca essa janela até 2007, parece que em quantidade de anos seria uma coisa boa para comparar pré e pós, mas até a coisa vingar mesmo, sabe? A gente está vendo aí nesse chart mesmo, nesse gráfico aí mesmo, que 2003 é praticamente zero. Mas o primeiro grande caso foi 2001. Então, será que teve um tempo até essa coisa entrar no ritmo e a gente ter uma quantidade boa de Fairness Opinion? Você acha que tem esse período de escala?
Eu vou conferir, tá, Paulo? Mas eu acho que não, pelo seguinte, aqui, na verdade, não é o Fairness of Opinion, aqui é os lawsuits.
Ah, tá.
O Fairness of Opinion já tinha, tanto é que na nossa amostra, uma tabela que a gente quer inserir, qual é a proporção de Fairness of Opinion para os deals. Então, digamos, teve 300, quantos a gente tem?
Essa era a próxima pergunta.
Isso já existe a partir de 2001, a amostra ali já é grande. Os lawsuits, que não eram tão comuns, até 2005, quando teve aquele primeiro caso do Transcariote, que daí de lá para cá explodiu. Mas os processos, não os Fairness of Opinions. A Fairness of Opinions sempre teve.
Isso. Então, uma outra coisa que eu também trabalho lá na base, né, que é o número de peer comparables. Vocês consideraram isso aí nos controles? Porque o termo controle só ficou genérico, né? Eu fiquei curioso para ver o que estava ali dentro.
Isso é interessante, eu não sei te responder. Tem que olhar isso e vou dar uma olhada.
Certo. Eu perdi os primeiros 3, 4 minutos ali. Esse trabalho está sendo feito com o Gabriel?
Está com o Gabriel,
Ah, tá. Se for a base que eu estou ajudando ali, então tem essa informação.
Não, ele que vai trabalhar nela. Para quem não sabe, ele vai lá com o Gabriel lá passar um tempo. Então, mas tu está trabalhando nisso com a gente, né?
Exato, exato. E um outro ponto aí, que também acredito que até pela fala final aí, que vocês fizeram alguns testes, eu acredito que faz sentido olhar, não sei se vocês olharam, sobre o tipo de deal, né? Se foi um vertical, um horizontal, sabe? Qual foi o tipo? Porque, a priori, aqui me pareceu que isso poderia gerar mais ou menos litigation risk, sabe? Poderia aumentar ou não aumentar o risco de litígio.
Eu não olhei isso, mas a gente tem feito muito mais os tipos de deals agora na revisão, Paulo. Assim, estamos olhando a questão que é going private, o tipo do bidding, e a questão se foi vertical ou horizontal é uma outra interessante também, porque tem uma diferença no prêmio que se paga de uma para outra.
Isso. Assim como o método de pagamento, né? Se é stock for stock ou cash.
Nesse aqui é cash, porque se for 100% stock, não é aplicável para o lawsuit.
Ah, legal.
Até pode ter um 50-50, sei lá, mas tem que ter cash, tem que ter pagamento em dinheiro.
Entendi. E a última que eu anotei aqui é quem paga pelo financial advisor, né? Porque tem casos em que o acquirer paga para os dois, o acquirer paga para o target, ou o target paga para ele mesmo, né? E pode ser que tenha diferença, tem um viés aí, né? De qual vai ser o valuation feito pelo financial advisor.
Tu lembra se tem isso na base de dados, Paulo?
Tem.
Tem? Boa, obrigado. Obrigado, vou dar uma olhada nisso aí, sim. Obrigado.
Beleza, é isso, eu termino aqui.
Obrigado.
Em tom de brincadeira, vocês já mandaram o paper para a corte de Delaware?
Ainda não. Mas Eu estou curioso. Eu, na verdade, assim, tem coisa que é boa e tem coisa que é ruim, né? Quando eu li esse gráfico aqui que a gente está mostrando, eu pensei, pô, para uma questão empírica, é uma maravilha. Mas para uma questão prática, ele me dá um medo, porque eu tenho medo de um revisor falar, pô, mas não tem mais processo, para que a gente precisa publicar esse troço? Porque agora, basicamente, os impressos desapareceram, né? Então, eu tenho um conhecimento acadêmico que se pode ganhar, mas se ninguém processar mais, qual é a relevância do artigo? Então, estou louco para esse troço subir de novo aí, para ver se o pessoal achar que ainda é importante.
Mas desculpa, eu não li o artigo todo, tá, Rodrigo? Mas não valeria, talvez vocês tenham feito uma consulta a advogados especialistas nisso para validarem essa história do agency, quer dizer, o manager pede um bid baixo para ficar coberto num eventual lawsuit, onde aí quem fez a avaliação não vai ser processado, seria ele está defendido por essa opinião qualificada.
Isso, não, sem dúvida, isso aí a gente precisa um pouco mais de institutional background, né?
Isso.
Eu, assim, por sorte, como eu trabalhei em alguns casos, eu sei que o pessoal usa isso nos expert reports. Então, que essa informação é utilizada, tem alguns estudos que e eu vi acontecer porque a gente fez no nosso appraisal lá, usando os peer choice. Mas a questão da implicação direta, né, nessa questão de appraisal lawsuit é uma coisa que não tem muita experiência. Talvez tinha que falar com os advogados. E existe um estudo feito pela Cornerstone Research, que é uma economic consulting, que eles falam que basicamente tinham aí 10, 15, 20 advogados e hedge funds que eram os centrais nisso aí, né? Eles viraram a estratégia deles nesse período de 2010 até 2017.
Muito legal, parabéns.
Desculpa, Ricardo.
Oi, Cassiano.
Eu fiquei curioso para saber se o resultado encontrado seria semelhante em estados como Nova York, por exemplo, apesar de ter uma legislação menos favorável para o shareholder até o final da negociação. Vocês não cogitaram estender o escopo da pesquisa para daqui a pouco pensar em estados mais pró-empresário e pró-M&A e caos M&A?
Na verdade, quase não tem lawsuit fora de Delaware. Esses appraisal. É uma regra de Delaware e que o precedência não aplica tanto para outros estados. Basicamente, tu olha o gráfico de lawsuits, é quase todo em Delaware.
Todo em Delaware.
Quase todo em Delaware. Mais alguma pergunta? Então, seria isso, Ricardo. Queria agradecer. Eu vou tirar a apresentação, mas obviamente fico aqui na próxima hora. Aí, quem quiser fazer bate-papo sobre qualquer coisa, prazer é meu. Deixa eu só desligar aqui.
Bom, muito obrigado, Rodrigo, em nome da sociedade. Foi ótimo. Bom, e aí agora, como o Rodrigo disse, estamos aqui num bate-papo informal para quem quiser conversar sobre outras coisas. Bom, muito obrigado a todos, pessoal.